All right, well, we got a lot of great questions in, so thank you, everybody. First question is for Sallie. There's a couple questions kind of about this, so I'll try to blend it into one. Someone wrote, what are the prospects for Congress or the USDA supporting your perspectives on soil health? And I'd maybe like to add to that, have you been thinking about policy and how you might want to be impacting policy?
Sure. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. So those soil principles I put up come from the National Resource Conservation Service, which is part of the USDA. So we could say the USDA has embraced our view of soil health. The problem is that there are a lot of other forces on the USDA, and the place that's really causing a problem now is the RMA, which is the part of the USDA that does crop insurance. And they have not embraced soil health because they don't have the actuarial data to allow them to do that. So when I think about it, if people always say we should go get the Farm Bill changed, we are working from the angle of I don't think the Farm Bill changes until the farmers in the Midwest call their senators and say, this crop insurance thing is not working for me. I can't make a living under the rules that I'm working under. So we're taking kind of sort of that approach. But the other thing we're doing around policy is we are funding development of new crop insurance policies that will allow farmers to implement the principles of soil health. So, and we think a lot about policy. I think what's important is to get the conditions to be ready for policy to change. I don't think that a bunch of activists just show up in DC and say, we need to change this. It's again about changing the culture and coming from the grassroots to change policy, and that's the approach we take. And we've done a lot of work in California because there was a moment there. We have a Healthy Soils Initiative. We got the headline, California pays farmers to sequester carbon. It's really kind of broken, but we got that, which seemed important. So we look for our moments in policy, I guess. And right now it seems to be around crop insurance and hopefully part of the Green New Deal.
What, if anything, did Buckminster Fuller say about consumerism?
Explicitly about consumerism other than his, I would say his condemnation or his questioning about the capitalist system in general, which he felt was obviously his idea was to optimize the use of resources, and that once again, I guess this would be maybe the indirect way of saying that he considered wealth not to be the production of widgets and things that we don't need to make money, but to use technology to support, nurture, and sustain life support. So I think that would be a comment that consumerism absolutely did not fit into that scenario, and I think I can say that confidently that if he ever said specifically, that's where he would be coming from.
Thank you. Sallie, another one. How have the effects of your regenerative agricultural practices been quantified, and what are some of the impacts that you've had through implementing these practices?
So I guess that question means on our ranch. I showed some pictures of the vineyard. We worked on improving the health of the soil before we planted the vineyard, and have seen pretty dramatic increases in soil organic matter and soil carbon documented by a lab at UC Davis, and those are ongoing. We've also, that's where we've seen the most impact is there. We do monitor soil carbon on the rangeland, and we know that over the course of the historic drought, we continue to lose soil carbon. So what we've seen on the rangeland is we have monitoring that shows an explosion of California native perennial plants and diversity, but we don't yet see improved soil carbon. Everybody thinks that's a lagging indicator. So I would say where we have actively managed with mob grazing and cover crops, we have already started to see results in 2 years. And on our crop ground, we've done our baseline monitoring, but we haven't re-monitored yet. So.
Great.
Thank you. Greg, I was hoping maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the world game. There's a lot of questions coming in about that. Do you imagine it primarily as a professional tool or a tool to inform and shift public opinion? Maybe you could just talk a little bit about
how you see the world game being rolled out and implemented?
Sure. Probably the best way to say that we're sort of reinventing or updating the original concept. The original game was a game that was played in a large, there's a public, usually geared towards schools and organizations, and they basically rolled out a huge Dymaxion map that was on a gymnasium scale, right floor, and kids positioned themselves on it, or players, to kind of get a sense of the geography. And it was made available to anyone that one, probably, and this is the key, could afford it, and in some cases, in many cases it was supplemented or subsidized by grants. But you obviously reach a limited audience because there are only so many facilitators and only so many of those that you could play. But there were no conditions on who it was for. The audience that Bucky targeted were the next generation of leaders, which were sort of middle school to college age students. But that didn't limit to that. Our goal is to try, and there was a lot to be gained from that face-to-face interaction, because you could see emotions, you could sort of people really getting into the idea of playing the game and feeling it. Our sense is that we'd like to continue to do as many of the those venues where there can be that face-to-face contact. We probably need to make it less cumbersome, probably some sort of projection of the map on the floor instead of having to take a really cumbersome thing and take it around. But the other idea is to, and we're kind of we're dealing with this sort of cautiously, is how to make an online presence. Because the idea is that we want anyone who wants to play should be able to play. The idea is to really sort of be a venue where the public at large can share in both their ideas and also share the data that we're using. I'll just say everything that we collect in terms of data and information will be publicly available. That's the way that the Bucky felt that it should happen. And as opposed to, you've got I put the emphasis on the military that has these tools that do this sort of analysis. Well, corporations do pretty much the same thing, right, in their risk analysis. They have the same sort of data, and they pay thousands and tens of thousands of dollars, right, to get access to this data so they can determine whether or not they want to make investments in other countries, so they do their assessment. Now, they take the same information, just as the military takes the same information, but they draw different conclusions than we would draw from the same information, if you know what I mean. And if you, in our case, if we saw that labor, maybe unions or labor organizing was strong, we would see that as a positive. If you're an investor, you probably wouldn't see that as that would be a negative. The same. So I guess that's part of where we're headed. The first phase, and this is important, if you go to our website, what we're asking for is folks who want to, and I mean this sincerely, help us design this next iteration of the World Game. We want to probably even target some colleges and universities, some young folks who say, because we want you to play, but you got to help us figure out how we design it so that young people will play it. Here's the scope. Here's what we're trying to do, but we don't pretend to be gamers or game developers. And the old world game, the previous visions really work well, but we feel like we want to take it to the next step, and that the way that we can do that is to really have a participatory kind of design phase, and we're just starting that. But if you go to the website, we're asking anybody that's even mildly interested and wants to be kept up to date, there's a place where you can drop your name.
Great. Thank you. Here's a question that I think both of you could answer, I'm sure. One of the audience members is curious about transition strategies and solutions that center on people let's see if I remember this right. That center on people whose economic lives are most precarious because of racialized capitalism. So what are the things that you're seeing or that you're doing that are really looking at the inequity of our system, and what are the solutions that we could foster that aren't further repeating these same inequities?
Oh, sure. I probably don't need that. Well, I think, I would use the examples or some of the examples that were brought out this morning, but there's no question that to me that the community organizing is a very powerful tool in terms of empowering people to take advantage of their numbers. There's a movement that's happening I think it's around the country. Certainly we see it happening in Boston in terms of a solidarity economy where people are realizing that they need to develop their strategies for, and I come back to Bucky's definition of wealth being, using technology to generate life support. So we're seeing this flourishing urban farming, not just urban gardening, which is important, but urban agriculture, and whether the proof will still be in the pudding as to whether or not we can find a way to make that economically viable. There's a little bit of tension in terms of, again, affordable, accessible food, and yet being able to support an urban farmer with a small piece of land. Our traditional farmers are finding it difficult to make a go of it. But I'm not sure that, once again, that was the other quote I was going to about making sense and not making money. That was a consumerism quote. But I think that's what these folks are doing. They want to make sense, not necessarily make a lot of money, but can we do that? So I think that we're seeing and a lot of young people, and this is the last point I'll make on this, but when we first started talking about urban gardening, and I remember teaching in the Roxbury at South Boston High School during court-ordered busing, many of the black students wanted to have nothing to do with farming because it just had so many linkages back to plantation slavery, and to them that was a step backwards. And then all of it, when they began to see the empowering aspects of being able to, and this is the key, being able to take some measure of control over meeting your basic needs, food, energy, shelter, that becomes a powerful piece. We're not going to be able to, I don't think it's going to be at all possible to make up the wealth gap that exists right now. The average wealth, what's the term? Anyway, the net worth, the average net worth of an African American in Boston, city proper, is $8. $8. The Boston Globe did a study and they said this is not a typo, folks. It's $8 as compared to $247,000 for white residents. So that, and when you take into consideration too the land that's been, so we have 98% of the land, agricultural land, is owned by whites, and many of that is confiscated from that. So I think we've got to look at a new way of doing this and putting the emphasis on using the kind of tools that the new alchemies and others were developing with it being in mind that this can help empower and make sort of that transition possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question when we think about it because, as you said, 98% of the land is owned by whites, and that there's hundreds of years of reasons that went into that. So what we're trying to do is we are focused on trying to create change on lots of acres with lots of farmers at the same time. Very consciously trying to work with groups that are improving the situation, supporting young farmers. There are all kinds of interesting young people, both urban and rural, Hispanic, African American. There's a blossoming interest in farming. So one way is to support this diverse group of young farmers that's coming on board and trying to support those groups that are addressing this issue. We are not actively addressing it, but we are trying to support people working on land access and immigrant farmers becoming farm owners and a lot of issues like that. So,
and just one last thing, that many of those disenfranchised individuals and communities are taking their own initiatives, and they're organizing, they're having their own meetings, they're networking, they're developing cooperatives. So they aren't necessarily waiting for the savior to come and do it. They basically are saying, we understand how we're going to do this. When we made our the Schumacher delegation to Cuba to take a look at their sustainable farming system, I was always interested in that most of the black participants were as interested, if not more interested, in the revolution and in the cooperative system that was set up, as opposed to the technical aspects of agroecology. They want to know the organizing piece and how you form the cooperatives and that sort of thing, and how the agrarian reform, which is sort of more front in their minds.
Thank you both. Sallie, this is a question for you. A couple people have asked about the meat industry, and one person in particular wants to know if the meat industry can change its ways to become carbon neutral or even net negative in terms of its emissions.
well, I think the answer is yes, but it means we have to completely upend it, and we have to take all the animals out of the confined animal feeding operations and put them back. Put them back where they belong and reintegrate livestock into cropping systems. So I think it's absolutely doable from a physical standpoint and a management standpoint Now, whether or not we can accomplish that, I don't know, but I think there are a lot of people who've run the numbers. And since we use something like 400 million acres now to grow corn, almost all of which goes to animals, putting animals back on the land, I think we can rework the meat business, the meat industry. If the precision fermentation in vats doesn't put us out of business first, which is an issue that I've been starting to think about. So I think that the meat industry is primed for huge disruption. And what we're trying to do is be ready so that animals are reintegrated in systems in a way that works ecologically and for the farmers.
Okay. Thank you. This question came in for Greg, but I think maybe both of you could take a shot at answering it. And one person in the audience wants to know about patterns in nature. And what can patterns of nature teach us about how we can better structure our human systems, social, ecological, economic, etc.? So, Greg, you want to take that first?
Sure. I think
Got it, Mike.
mine working for some reason, but forget the name of the authors, but there's an MIT Press book, and it is entitled "Patterns of Nature as a Model for Design and Humans Meeting Human Needs," and that really has been sort of not just, and this is not just Fuller, but that sort of was the mantra and the guidance for places like New Alchemy, using nature and patterns in nature as the model for design. Looking at that pattern as sort of being the way of understanding, especially in nature. The patterns of nature help make the invisible visible. Those are the forces that sort of, and the structure. When Bucky said he sort of discovered the coordinates of nature, the coordinates of nature are defined geometrically, and I think from the sacred geometries of the past to sort of the more scientific approaches to it today, there's a linking thread through all of that, and that is, I'll use one quote, I forget who it was, that God geometrizes, and that's all, and that is sort of the idea behind the designing in ways that are sustainable and resilient. And I'll just reemphasize the one point that Fuller made, in that in every part of nature, everything is functional, and that beauty emerges as a result and consequence of that.
We think about this all the time, and I referred to it in my talk, but I think nature is incredibly collaborative, and nature is very abundant and diverse. So nature there are principles which scale across the globe and probably the universe that have to do with life, but then they are expressed in a context, in the middle of collaboration. So I think that's how we think of it. That everything is connected, and everything should be sharing and collaborating, and that we should use that much more as a design principle. Deborah Friese and I did a presentation recently where we talked about the giant oak tree and what its role is in the whole system. And it's connected to everything else in the system, and there's all this sharing of resources. It's not that the giant tree stands by itself. We kind of have, especially in America, this, I'm an individual on my own building something. It's like, no, that's not the way nature works, and I don't think that's the way we should design our systems if we want to be successful.
One other just quick thing, because Fuller suggested, don't fight forces, use them, work with them, and you'll be able to, that's a design principle. But the other thing is, some of these are very simple, and a lot of the, most of the forces and most of the patterns in nature are co-functions. And I think they almost always incorporate opposites. Tension and compression only coexist. And he talked about that as one of those eternal principles, that you take a rope and you tense it in this direction, but it compresses in that direction. And what he pointed out was that nature, if you look around, will almost, and so you can't have one without the other, but nature almost always emphasizes tension as opposed to compression. Because most materials are stronger in tension. Nature, he says, seldom pushes, almost always pulls. And this is where the language piece comes in, because it's a misnomer to say the wind blows. The wind doesn't blow. The wind is pulled from a high pressure system to a low pressure system. You blow, it goes in a curl. It just doesn't work. Water from the tree from the gets the water, evapotranspiration, right? And again, it pulls the water up the tree, right, through evapotranspiration and evaporation. And over and over and over again, you can see that those patterns, those strategies, those techniques are always incorporated in ways that optimize resources to bring about the best results in life support and planet.
Great, thank you. We've got time for one or two more questions here. Greg, this one's for you. How can the world game inform place-specific solutions necessary to prepare for climate change?
I think, I go back and without doing it in a cliche way, to thinking globally, acting locally. I think I'm seeing it happen in communities, as a matter of fact, in California, Cooperation Jackson and Jackson, Mississippi, but also here in the Berkshires, where start to look at how advanced and even some new technologies can perhaps play a role that are being developed. I think that might seem at first glance inconsistent with some of the goals of local, but I think that concepts like 3D printing, Makers Center, I mean, these are things that I think are starting to take hold, and for I'll say this, in our own organization, promoting the concept of community-supported industry, right? As community-supported agriculture, we kind of get, it's sort of there. Community-supported industry, import substitution can be a little bit more difficult, as I was trying to get into when I mentioned some of the things about renewables, but component parts and pieces can actually now be, it's amazing with 3D printing and other advanced technology. So rather than dismiss all sort of technology, and I would probably say even AI and other things, the goal is going to be selective, to be discriminate, to be thoughtful about what the goals are, and then what are the appropriate technologies that are being developed globally, some of them not just here, but that transfer of the technology can then actually add and benefit the local economies.
Great. Well, I think we are actually at the end of our time together, so I'd like you all to join me in thanking our two speakers today. Thank you.